very pleased to be joined on stage today alongside three experts in compliance globally. So on this panel, we'll be talking about virtual training and what are companies doing to adapt to this new normal that we were sort of thrust in unwittingly a few months ago. With me are Susan Divers, who is a longtime friend and partner to Ethisphere, but more importantly, a very experienced global chief compliance officer herself. Now she's with LRN, has a lot of expertise in training. We also have Joanne Haribe, I hope I'm pronouncing Haribe correctly, okay, who's the global chief compliance officer of Magna International in Canada, and Ilona Niemi, I hope I'm pronouncing that right as well, who I'm pleased to congratulate a few weeks late as the new global chief compliance officer or chief compliance officer of Cooperators Group in Canada. So I'm going to go off camera, and Susan, the microphone is all yours.
Great. Well, thanks, Stefan. It's always a pleasure to be at any Ethisphere event. And this is, I think I looked back, and this is probably 10 years for me of being involved. And let's jump in because we had a few technical issues getting started. But I'm really delighted to be with both Joanne and Ilona. And the discussions we've had getting ready for this panel have been very, very interesting. So just to sort of set the stage a bit, you should be able to see a screenshot of LRN every year does an annual program effectiveness report, which looks at what is actually working in terms of programs, what elements should you emphasize, where do you get the biggest investment ROI. And we look at it from the point of view not of checklists, but of program resonance and culture. So it's on our website, and I would say it's interesting reading. It came out just before the pandemic hit, but it's interesting to see how many of our findings actually are relevant. So Chelsea, if you go to the next one. In looking at the COVID crisis, we've had a number of webinars about it. And we've had just sort of over attendance almost and practically had to turn people away, which goes to show how broad the impact has been. But one of the things that we've seen is that people have described it, I think, accurately as a stress test for ethics and compliance programs. And looking at some of the most recent guidance by the regulators, it's certainly an event that is unexpected, which is a good basis to evaluate your program and see how you actually coach and see how it coped with the new challenges that involved. And we've listed some of the themes that we've seen in doing webinars and talking with our partners, such as communication, ease of access, leadership engagement, looking at whether you're having consistency of outcomes, and updating your risk assessment. So what Ilona and Joanne are going to talk about today very much reflects those factors. So next slide, Chelsea. So in setting the standard for that, it's, I think, helpful to look at some of the findings. I'm not going to read through them, but as you can see, these deal with what we found with respect to training programs. And, you can see that communicating organizational values is a characteristic of high-performing programs, employee feedback, translations, incorporating measures to test your effectiveness, providing options to employees. And this is what I'm going to come back to in a minute, working on mobile devices. One of the lessons I think that's emerging from the crisis is that ease of access and making your whole program, not just training, available to people, I think is going to emerge as a key focus. And Chelsea, if you can go to the next one. And I'm going rapidly through these so that we can dive into the discussion. But on this slide, what we've done is we've distilled what the regulators have said, and there's a lot of acronyms, but it's basically Department of Justice, the Antitrust Division, OFAC, French Anti-Corruption, and the Serious Fraud Office. And as you can see, the regulators have gotten much more demanding about, or let's say at least detailed, in what they expect when they evaluate a program. And they're really looking for training that engages and that isn't just sort of, as Ellen Usby once said, an enormous sheepdip. So these are some of the practices that we pulled out of regulators' guidance. And then Chelsea, the next one. So to give you an example of what a mobile app can look like, we do have one. Since there were questions about it in our pre-discussion, I took a screenshot of it. But being able to follow your business wherever it goes and deliver it basically via mobile phone, I think is probably the direction that people will start moving in. And we do have some of our partners do use the mobile app to great effect. And Chelsea, last of my slides. And part of that, I was just in the discussion about policy simplification. And here we have two examples we've done for some of our partners where we've taken complicated policies and turned them into interactive PDFs where people can click to get topics and be directed to FAQs. And then those in turn link to the procedures that you need to follow, whether it's getting permission for a gift or an entertainment, and that fits well with mobile apps. So with that, Chelsea, let's put up Joanne's slides next, and let's jump in and hopefully establish the context. And Joanne, just let Chelsea know when you want to go to the next slide. So let's each start with you describing briefly what your training program looks like now and how it's evolved during the COVID crisis, and then we'll get into some specifics as well. Joanne, if you want to go ahead.
Sure, thanks, Susan. Before I start, for some of you who don't know about Magna, I just want to give a little bit of background. So we are a technology company, but primarily in automotive parts. We have 160,000 employees worldwide in 28 different countries. So, our global footprint's very significant for us. And so in terms of what we had to do with COVID, given that we're manufacturing we've got about 300 plants around the world, a lot of them were shut down and people were either, crazy busy trying to figure out how to ensure safety when we restarted, or they were furloughed. So we actually made the choice to pause our training because it just would have seemed tone deaf to require still people to complete their training within the 30 days and all of that. And myself and my team, we really took the time to then really pivot in terms of, okay, what's the training program going to look like in the short term, but also potentially in the long term. So we were already looking at what is our compliance onboarding program going to look at and what makes sense for us. So as you can see, this was kind of the onboarding program for the last 5 years, where a significant portion was in person, right? We had, for our most senior people, in terms of our highest risk employees, a 4-hour in-person session. So we knew we wouldn't be able to do that probably, not until 2022. We were anticipating for the rest of 20 for sure, and given travel restrictions and budget cuts, probably for the rest of 21. So we have pivoted, next slide please, Chelsea, to moving everything to, instead of in person, to live WebEx. And we'll see. We're still in the process of creating it, but really trying to figure out, okay, how could we ensure that our people, especially our new people, when we're talking about onboarding, are getting the key Magna messages in terms of what matters in the code, but also in a time efficient way. And so again, as you can see, we've replaced that 4-hour in-person session that really focused on a lot of scenarios and really discussing decision making, right, and ethical decision making. And we've really focused in on that to roll out on live WebEx. Again, we're still building it. I'll certainly update anybody that wants to know how it went. But if it goes well, then we'll keep it going that way. And I'll redeploy my regional compliance training officers, in different ways. And we'll continue to do onboarding this way. But those are just some of the highlights of how we've had to pivot.
Sounds like you really did pivot, Joanne. Thanks. Alona, do you want to give us a similar overview of what you're doing at the Cooperator Group?
Thank you, Susan. And before I start, the Cooperators is one of the leading insurance companies here in Canada. We also have mutual funds and investment businesses. And I really had the opportunity, as Stefan already mentioned, to actually onboard 2 months ago during the COVID and change the company. So I have been also received for the training in online environment. And before that, I was in a global and Canadian position for compliance, working for Zurich Insurance in Toronto, plus also back in Switzerland. So I always see that in that COVID world, there were 4 different phases for financial services industry, or there will be 4 different phases. And I'm hoping that you all are able to see the slide around how did it look like for financial services in the pre-COVID world. So we had a very strong regime for training because it's part of the DNA what financial services companies are doing. Increasingly, it's really delivering the value-based approach, not just ticking the boxes. So we had a strong 3-year plan covering all kind of compliance risk, mandatory computer-based training. We complement that training with awareness and in-person and targeted training efforts. And when the COVID hit, it's very important to understand that the risk scenario really changed. There was new emerging risks. Some risk did have much bigger impact on our operations. Some risk potentially lowered the impact. And consequently, we needed to adapt with our training program. And not like in John's case, that there were full stop for the training program. We actually did go from the office environment to the working from home environment. We decided and we kept the entire mandatory training. And also we did make some adjustments that we rolled it over a little bit earlier than it was supposed to be, so that the employees had the opportunity to take it whenever they wanted and have a reminder earlier in the year. Where we had the biggest changes and we really shifted the planning and prioritization is those targeted training sessions and awareness. When there was that COVID starting period, it is really a kind of, in a way, crisis for every single organization. You need to find the word new. You need to make things happening. And it's the similar thing for training. We couldn't expect delivering over awareness or targeted training in a similar kind of manner. We needed to really start thinking like, how do we make it happen? And the most important part in that change was that once we understood the new kind of risk where we need to focus on and deliver, if it was data privacy, if it was the fair treatment of consumers, we really needed to make sure that we are part of the discussions at the higher kind of level where the decisions are made, so that we can package it differently. We needed to stay relevant ongoingly. we needed to demonstrate different kind of flexibility as a team. We needed to take the time whenever it was available for us. We couldn't select it. We also needed to make sure that we integrated our messaging into the bigger kind of team meetings, into the business meetings. And at the end, it was also making sure that we are remembered. There's a lot of information coming. There's also a lot of competing priorities, not just in the office environment, but in the home environment. How do we make sure that our employees really think about the training and what really needs to be those key messages? And based on that, we made the decision really to make a little bit different kind of shift. It was really going to the basics. It was using pictures. It was using very simple sentences. Those are the things that there was time for the employees to read and also the managers to tell back to their teams. So now when we are thinking, when we are thinking really where this everything is heading, I really see that the bigger innovation is starting now with the thinking and learnings that are coming from the COVID-19 environment. I'm seeing a lot of that we will have much more use of technology. We will have much more customized experiences. And we will also see that we as a second line will be delivering much more the content, but the business and first line and people managers are really driving the effort. So thank you, Susan. I hand it over to you. Back to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Ilona. That's a very impressive example, as Joanne's, of pivoting and adapting your training program to the new realities. Joanne, you did get a question, which is, how do you manage your compliance introduction training for shop floor employees if they don't have email addresses? How do you track participation and attendance?
Unmute. So for us, often the onboarding for shop floor employees is included with all the other HR training that the HR managers would deliver when a new shop floor employees start. So we have a compliance video along with some slides that then the HR manager will play. So if there are 30 new employees, they're all starting in a room together. They're playing that kind of encapsulated video tool that'll cover that. They'll then hand out the code of conduct and ethics and get the signed acknowledgement from each employee that they have read the code and agreed to abide by it. So it's low tech, but it seems to work. In some situations where the division does have, computers in the breakout, the cafeteria or something like that, occasionally then the HR managers will have the employees, log in to the computer in their office or in the cafeteria, and then they could do the training online. So we've done kind of both modalities, and I'd say probably right now more are opting for the low tech version in terms of training in the large group setting and handing things out manually.
And then you do sign-in sheets virtually to track that. Yeah. Well, again, that's a great example of adaptability. Ilona, can I turn back to you? And you mentioned that you're moving towards a more customized approach in terms of recasting your training. Can you give us some other examples of how you're doing that? And then, Joanne, I'm going to ask you the same question too.
Thank you, Susan. I think that the customized thing is really now starting. Customization has always been part of our mandatory training in that sense that we have had for people managers and different functions, different kind of tasks when they are completing the web-based training. But when we are now talking after COVID world about customization, for me, it's really about having the choice of doing things. It's also making sure that the learning system adapts to the knowledge and the past experiences with a specific employee in that entire training journey. And I'm really thinking a lot that what is so important, that we have had training mentality for a very long time. That training is kind of one type of situation across the year. It has not been the experience spanning over the year. It has got much better throughout the years, but I think that that's where the customization will really come and benefit, so that the employees can jump on the training when it's comfortable for them at the right kind of level. And also that the experience is not just when they choose to do the training, it's also the built-in kind of training, the micro-learning. When, for example, an employee might be doing the expense report in the system, if it's SIP or anything else, they might get a reminder around anti-bribery, anti-corruption control. Or the next time you are logging in a system where there's a lot of claims-related sensitive data, you might get a line around your data protection responsibilities. So customization is, for me, making sure that there's the individual experience, but at the same time point, it's also making sure that there's the continuous engagement, and hopefully also it resonates with a better kind of retention. Because I think that's where many of us struggle in the learning world. How do you make the retention better? So those are the things that I'm really looking forward to working during the next year. Some of that requires technological solutions. Some of that is just thinking the training journey differently over time span, and also thinking it more holistically, not having necessarily 10 different kind of trainings a year. It might be much more comprehensive, a little bit similar like the code of conduct, but more in depth. And I'm also thinking that we need to be very mindful that the trainer in the future is no more the frontline lecturer, the typical kind of professor. It will be really a person who is able to understand the insights coming from the data. It's a person who is able to reflect the feelings from the audiences. It's the person who is able to continuously improve. So I think that will be a very important step for the compliance organizations, really to make the investment, in particular to the right kind of skill set, so that we can get the training program and the customization to the next level. Thank you, Susan.
Thanks, Ilona. And I think that also reflects both the letter and the spirit of the guidance that's been coming out from regulators. We used to, at Bellum meetings, talk about the old Soviet-style module where you were lectured for 45 minutes and you wanted to jump out a window by the end of it. And, you know, we're moving very far from that. And that's a good example. Those are good examples. So Joanne, if you would talk to us about what you're doing, not just with customization, but other innovative means that you're using to engage your workforce in this virtual environment. And then we'll talk about technology after that a bit.
Sure. I think for us, customization is something we've been looking at, especially for the last year or so, more based on our program maturity. So I started this program 7 years ago. So I'd say we're probably kind of moving into mid-range program maturity. And because of that, we could really see we need to really make it, the training, much more functional specific to have it really be relevant for people's jobs. So we're kind of already on that path. And so I think COVID's helped us to accelerate that. But also for us, we just launched a learning management system last year. So that's also really helped us move forward in terms of delivering very customized content to our employees based on function, which we didn't really have a great ability to do in the past. You know, of course, if you're delivering it virtually, it's a lot easier to roll out a lot of different sessions as opposed to when we were in person. We had to be kind of more generic in terms of creating sessions that would apply to everybody. So that's it for customization. In terms of innovative solutions, one of the things that we're really focusing on is trying to deputize more people to be compliance ambassadors. So really empowering our managers to be our compliance ambassadors for us. Given that my regional compliance officers are not going to be able to visit the plants for a little while, and perhaps with less frequency even going forward due to budget constraints, really figuring out how can we arm our managers with effective tools to deliver compliance messages. So we did try for several years to roll out trainer in a box training along that same concept. It failed for a bunch of different reasons, but I think it was probably overly ambitious in terms of expecting the managers to do too much, right? That they were delivering, 45-minute training sessions. So I'd like to think we're a little bit smarter now in terms of, much more shorter bursts, much more kind of discrete tools that, a manager who's a little more nervous about speaking and training can just kind of plug and play and then add his or her reinforcing message to it. But for the managers that are a little more comfortable, a little more savvy about training, then, give them some other pieces that they could use if they want to create something a little more customized for their team. So I think the idea of having it be short and sweet and arming the managers with different tools that they can customize depending on their personal style and their roles.
Well, that's another great example of customization and pivoting and flexibility. Before we move on to talk about some of the different technology solutions that are out there and what works and what doesn't, we have a question, which is for both of you. Can you talk about how you track employee feedback from the compliance training sessions? And then how do you incorporate that feedback into your vision and do you map it to what the regulators expect as well? How are you handling that? So Ilona, if you've got some thoughts on that, and then Joanne, that would be great.
Thank you, Susan. That's an excellent question, and I always think that that's a little bit a balancing act. I always welcome, I think the core point is that when there's a feedback, we receive it and we receive it positively. It means that someone has taken the time to think and also really adjust what the training is trying to achieve, meaning that something is coming out. So I think the first thing is always make sure that we recognize those employees who provide the feedback. But then to the integration question, I very often see that there's two types of comments. There's one related to the content. There might be some aspects that they might seem to see from the training perspective when it was built, that it makes a lot of sense. And then once there's the employee experience, there might be wordings, there might be procedural issues, there might be even smaller things that is not totally adapted to the local environment, which is very often very, very important to make sure that there's the diversity available in that training. Sometimes the comments are really related to that. And then there's the other one that is related to technicalities, meaning wording. For example, sometimes the questions might be not understood in a similar way when we ask test questions. And we need to really start thinking what makes sense. So there's a really those two types of feedback that we normally receive. So in both of the cases, we carefully, it's very manual process, we collect the information And where before then next time we have a refresh of all the trainings. It happens on an annual basis. We will take a look at all of that and make sure that those ones where we think about that it enhances the end user experience, meaning that provides better experience for the employees. We will always incorporate those ones. And I think that in most of the instances, what I have been seeing throughout my career, when there's a feedback provided, in most of the instances, it's an issue that we can really incorporate. Sometimes smaller wording changes, it doesn't really make sense. But in most of the cases, there's a lot of always input that is very, very important to integrate. So that would be my response to that question. Is really manually collecting it throughout the year before the refresh taking place, and then making the decision carefully what goes into the refreshment, what not. And as I said, it's very important to recognize those employees who are providing the feedback, because that's how we make the program really kind of a living and breathing experience. Thank you, Susan.
Thanks, Alana. That's a great example of communication too, going back and forth. Joanne?
So when we were doing our in-person sessions, we were following up with a SurveyMonkey survey to get employee feedback and incentivizing people to complete the survey by, awards from the Magna store in terms of swag. So I suspect we'll do something like that when we move to live WebEx sessions also. I think the other way that we try and get feedback is through test out. So, it's a little bit kind of backwards, but again, we've had great success with test out before our e-learning, and it's something that we are relying more and more on. And I think that to me is an indirect way to get feedback about, what are your employees really understanding? So if everybody fails the pretest on bribery and improper payments, that shows me that there's some additional work to do. And that would drive us to then look at creating additional, training sessions on bribery, for example. So that's another way that we generate feedback and use that in our program.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing, which is we're building, and we have a lot of features in our platform that can tell you how long people spend on particular modules, what questions they struggle with, and other really interesting insights, because sometimes that indirect feedback can provide even more insights, and that's definitely where the industry is moving. So with that, let's talk about what technology has worked for virtual engagement. There seem to be the Zoomites, and then the Microsoft Team advocates, and there's WebEx Classrooms, Adobe Connect. Alona, let's start with you. What are you finding is working well in that area in terms of engaging people?
Thank you, Susan. That is a very interesting question, because I also feel like when we entered in this COVID world, I also think that it was not a really question like, what are we going to use to make this work? It was just, what do we have there? And we make that work. And I think that I have been very fortunate that I have had access to WebEx and also Teams. I always feel that Teams is in a way more user-friendly and makes the interactions easier if it's in a training or otherwise. It has a very good chat functionality. It has a very good sharing functionality. But I also think that this technology piece and how to make it work And I really like what Sean just said, making the businesses and the managers as ambassadors. And I think that that has been also the key learning from this entire experience, that it has been a lot of making sure that you find the way that the messages will be delivered. And very often it has been then that the managers, people leaders, will deliver the messages using the tools that they use in their daily interactions, if it's a WebEx call or Teams call. And it has been very important for the compliance organizations to make sure that the managers who are doing and delivering that message, that they have the tools to make that properly. So it's really making sure that they have the right kind of talking points so that we have a consistent messaging. And also, in case questions comes back to us, how do we collect that one and make sure that there is the feedback loop back to the employees who have been asking those questions that the managers might not have had the response. But I'm really seeing that now when this entire situation has normalized and we see that the new normal, I'm sure that I will spend much more time really thinking, and I'm sure that all other compliance officers as well, how do we deliver in this environment? What really is the kind of right tool? Do we just use the tools that are out there, or do we go to a different kind of experience? And I think that the experience is the right word. I don't always know if the Teams or WebEx is an experience. I think that we need to get over training to the next level. There's an experience, like in many other areas, compliance is already there, that we are seeing as an integral part of something, and we are providing a kind of experience. In training, we are not yet there, and we need to think about what are we doing so that we are catching up and decreasing the kind of gap that we now have compared training to all other compliance program elements. And I think that what you just mentioned at the beginning around the app, building the experience in one platform, making it easy, connecting all those dots, that's the technology that I think most of us are now aiming and trying to make work. And I see that that requires obviously a lot of thinking, because it cannot be just on-the-shelf product for everyone. You can build on the on-the-shelf product, but in a way it needs to be customized to all your employees, the diversity, if it's and geographies. So it will be a journey that will definitely take longer time when we really come to the use of the new kind of technology beyond the WebEx and Teams. That's the main tools that we were using in the initial COVID times and now during the normalization. Thank you, Susan.
Thanks, Alona. That makes a great deal of sense. I'll just make one comment before turning it over to Joanne. Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer, in thinking about the app, said, what if we all had to do our shopping with Amazon on our laptops? So why shouldn't our compliance programs be on our mobile phones too? So with that, Joanne, if you could talk about your experience with the technologies out there and how you've used them. And then I think we've got 5 minutes left, just FYI.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. So we did evaluate all the different platforms out there. I'd love to be able to use Zoom because I think their breakout room functionality is fantastic, but IT won't let me due to the security concerns. We do have access to Teams as well as WebEx, and we're going with WebEx Classroom. Again, for me, it was the breakout room functionality. I think our employees, based on our in-person experience, learn as much from each other in terms of grappling with different ethical scenarios than they do from, me or our trainers. So I really didn't want to lose that ability for people to have, robust breakout discussions. So WebEx Classroom is telling us that they can deliver on that. So here's hoping that happens. Just following up on Alona's comments about having an app, I certainly would love to be able to, roll out lots of things through an app. And hopefully, again, COVID will accelerate that for us. We have had a Magna app for a little while, but communications department wasn't getting great traction. Now, every one of us has to go to our app every single day to answer the health questionnaire, to show the green screen to get into our buildings. So I think because of that, we're now used to, using the app and looking at it every day. So my hope is that'll kind of accelerate things to use it more broadly for things like microbursts of training.
Ah, well, that's interesting. Yeah, how the green screen is driving things.
Exactly.
Well, great. I think we're just about out of time, but let's do a real quick round with the two of you, and I could talk for another hour, but we can't. What do you see sticking and staying going forward as in the wake of the crisis? Alona?
I personally think that there's several things that I see that will stick, but at the same time, but I think there's certain things that are quick wins, and then there's others that require some additional thinking. I think that the one piece that is for me a kind of highlight and one of the quick wins is really the collaboration and coordination between first and second line functions during the crisis. It has been very natural to provide the training and messaging throughout the general avenues, not as a kind of side on. It has been embedded and integrated. And that's for me something that I'm really looking forward and building further. And then there's obviously those much more obvious ones, that there will be the development to use technologies. There will be the development ensuring that we have the customized experience. There will be the development that we will be even further repositioning our training, so that our training is really about making sure that we enable our employees to do the right thing for our clients and other stakeholders. I think that it has always been there, but I think that that's something that I see coming from this crisis even further, because all of us need to think about our clients, repositioning ourselves, and also rebuilding the trust vis-a-vis different kind of stakeholders, and retaining again back to the normality. And I think that the training will play very different kind of role. So those are a few of the highlights that I really think about will be remaining from this experience for the next years to go.
Nicely put. Joanne?
I think it's a double-edged sword. So I think the more effective that we are at delivering virtual training, the less likely we are to get, money and time to be face-to-face with people. So, while I do want to be effective virtually, I don't want to lose that ability to still be, front and center with people and looking them in the eyes when it's needed. So I think it'll have to be a balance, but I do worry a little bit that virtual training will stick, and people will be less likely to support in-person training and people, flying around the world again to do it.
Oh, well, good point. Sobering note, but very good point. Well, I want to thank both of you. It's been such an enjoyable 45 minutes, and I want to thank Ethisphere. And I think we've dealt with all the questions, and I hope we get to do another panel at some point in a year, looking back and seeing what's come true and what hasn't. So thanks again.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all three of you. That was a great way to close day 2 of the summit.